So everybody probably got it button on their screen, so they can see it as we continue. So thank you for the invitation. The material that I've got is extremely complex. It's going to take a lot more than the hour or the hour and a half that we've got. So I'm not going to touch on every single point, but I will scan through everything, and I'll pick up on key points I think would be most prevalent, that we'd like to try and get across this evening. So the first thing, as Tricia mentioned, this is being recorded, so just be aware of that. And the second is that I want you to know I'm not a lawyer. Anything that I'm telling you, or a financial expert, although I consider myself fairly competent in the arena of financial matters. I'm not licensed. So I'm talking to you as a landlord and someone who's just keenly interested in this topic. You've already seen everything that's on the screen. I own 71 units in 7 small apartment buildings. I run the Landlords Association. I've published 2 books, about 400 pages each, on the business of landlording. And I teach a 6-day course also on the subject. So to the matter that we're here tonight, affordable housing is a very complex topic. And if there's one thing that makes this even more complicated, is everyone confuses affordable housing with social housing, or housing rent geared to income and things like that. And they're really 2 separate things. When I talk about affordability, it could be someone who's in an upper scale, net income bracket and wants to buy a house, but it costs $1 million and they can only afford $750,000. Well, they're in the same situation as a low income person who can't, buy a $400,000 home, because none of them exist anywhere. So I'm talking about affordability in general terms. And if you reduce it to its most basic universal definition, we're really talking about the ability to have enough money to buy something. I mean, that's what affordability is all about. Unfortunately, CMHC and governments around the world really have a one-sided, narrow view of affordable housing as a price to income ratio. In other words, they want rental units that are 30% below whatever the person is making. And even their newest program, CMHC, has a program out that's coming out in March, and it's tied to what the median renters are making in 2019. And as you'll see, that is fatally flawed, overly simplistic, and causes no end of grief and trouble. We've had affordable housing issues since the 1930s. You can go back that far. And if you look at the legislation archives, which I have, in the 1970s, I would argue 80% of everything we're talking about is exactly the same as what they were talking about back in the 1970s. So one of the things that I've never seen anybody write or mention, and it dawned on me, when we talk about affordability, we have extensive legislation that prevents anybody from being able to buy a house without going through proper tests. And the one that we all know, of course, is the stress test, where you have to be able to qualify 2 percentage points higher than what you would know, whatever the interest rate is, the prevailing interest rate is. But there are all kinds of other things. Your debt service coverage ratio is a big one, and there's nothing like that for tenants. So tenants can go and spend 80% of their income, and no one is going to say anything. And we as landlords have to undertake that responsibility. And I don't think that's really sunk in with the politicians, the media, or even the tenants. And that's why we often get criticized for being biased or even prejudiced, when all we're trying to do is make sure that we pay the rent on, pay our mortgage on time, and that's based on them paying the rent on time. everything that we talk about, when we talk about affordable housing, the word affordable means money. It's related to money. So when we talk about affordability, the tenant wants affordability because they want more money to buy other things and do other things. The politicians want more money for their tenants because it's the tenants that get them in power, not the landlords, right? My estimation is that there's probably 80 tenants for every one landlord in Ontario. It's an 80-to-1 ratio, which means there are 80 voters for every one landlord voter. And the media, of course, wants tenants to have more money because that's where the eyeballs are. It's the tenants who really fund newspapers like the Star, which I say with some condescension, by the way, the Toronto Star. So it's always comes down to the money. Anything else that people talk about, it's altruistic, meaning that it's utopian or highly desirable, or it's misdirection. They don't really want to talk about it. The government in particular has come out last week or two, or sorry, last summer with a speculator's tax. They came out in December of this year. They want to pass a renovictions tax. I'm not going to get into this. You guys can read this on your own because it's not what I really want to spend too much time on. But if you email me after the presentation, I will send you this whole document. All right. So they want to tax renovictions. If you do a minimal renovation, a minimal renovation, and whatever the hell that means, and you didn't spend enough, but you jack up the price significantly, they want to tax you on that. In my opinion, all that's going to happen is, first of all, the tax just adds more cost, so it's not affordable, which is sort of counterproductive to the whole concept. And secondly, landlords simply won't renovate anymore. So the quality of the inventory, the whole housing stock will degrade, and consequently, so will tenant lifestyles. They want to tax, they just started talking about this, they want to tax any home that's over $1 million. Well, in Toronto, that works out to 13% of the total housing inventory is over $1 million. And in Vancouver, it's over 25%. The rest of the country will be probably okay. Here's where I wanted to sort of get a key point across. Who is making the money in real estate and driving up property prices? We hear about speculators, we hear about foreign investors, we hear about the flippers, and other types of, I don't know, influencers, if you will. And when I go and look at all of the ongoing costs, now there are two sets of costs. There's the one-time cost to acquire a property or to sell it, and there's the ongoing cost to run and manage the property. So if you take a quick gander at this list, I'm not going to go through them all. Property taxes represent typically between 15 and 20% of the total income of the property, which means if you make $1,000 on that property, $200 goes to the city, automatically off the top, pre-tax. All right. After you've worked your butt off for the year to try and make ends meet, pay all the bills, and you show yourself a profit, the government then takes 50% of all that money. All right. They also take capital gains. They take land transfer. They've got carbon tax. The utilities, most of the utilities are owned by, especially water, is owned by what else? Municipalities, right? And because they're monopolies, they generally don't have any competitive incentive to try and manage their costs. One-time costs. If you haven't heard of recoverable capital cost allowance, that is a significant cost when you sell the property. All of the depreciation that you took off from your property over the years all has to be paid back. That can be as much or even more than the capital gains that you have to pay. So after they've taken you 15% off the top and the 50% at the back end, when you sell the property, you have to again give probably somewhere between 25 and 40% of all the profit that you made over the lifetime ownership of that property. Development charges, municipal delays. If you've never heard of cash in lieu, developers can pay money to the government so that they don't have to build a park. Well, right now, the greater GTA has $5 billion surplus sitting in a bank account while they're crying about not being able to find any affordable housing. It's called contributions in lieu, CIL. Look it up. You'll see it. There's a vacancy tax as well. Vancouver is doing that. I think it's 15% if you leave a property empty. All that's going to happen with the speculation tax and the vacancy tax and the foreign ownership tax is they're going to add that on to the price of the property when they sell it. So it's not like they're doing anything to make it more affordable. All that's going to happen is they're going to drive the prices up. Any tax is a cost. The stress test locked out 200,000 Canadian families over the 2 years ago when I looked at the statistic. That means 200,000 families couldn't compete, which you would presume would impact the ability to buy a property. But what it also did was prevent those 200,000 families from moving out of where? Their rental property. So all these people who had the money to buy a property but couldn't because of the stress test are locked into the high end of presumably the higher end of the rental stock, which means all the people that were below them can't move up. And that has a cascading effect all the way down to the low income people who can't even get in, and the new students and so on. So it's backfiring. And again, it's just another cost that's added to the to the equation. And then there's all these other influences. Most people don't know that there are more people leaving the construction business because of retirement than are going into that business. So if that's happening, those skill sets become scarcer. What happens? Labor prices go up. The government makes a substantial amount of its money from real estate. Particularly, it makes a lot of that money from the profitability of the property. In other words, MPAC, when they determine the value of a property, an investment property, not a house, not a single family home, an investment property, they look at how profitable that property is, and then the city attaches a tax rate to that profitability. So if the property is more affordable, then the property is less profitable. If it's less profitable, then the value of that property will drop, which makes it affordable, but at the same time, property taxes will drop because it's based on the value of the property. So it's a paradox, if you will, or a serious conflict of interest. The more affordable the housing, the less affordable it is to government. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And if municipal taxes go down, services will go down. They can't do the garbage, police force, fire department, road maintenance, snow plowing, sewers, all of these things that we take for granted, the hospitals, all of those things will be impacted. So what is the city's solution going to be? Raise taxes. Okay, if they raise taxes, then my property taxes have gone up, which makes my property less affordable. It's a vicious circle, and they can't win. So on the one hand, I sympathize with government because they're in a catch-22. On the other hand, I criticize them because they're not being open and honest about this. All they do is they keep on taxing more under the illusion that they're going to curtail demand. So to be clear, I'm not against taxes. And in fact, if you went online and you looked at a situation with the US state of Kansas. The Republican Party was voted in, and they voted in a minimalist government that would not get involved. They were going to cut back on everything. Well, it wiped out and absolutely destroyed their economy. So that's a topic that might be worth investigating, to realize that the answer isn't about reducing taxes. It's about redirecting the taxes where they make sense and getting politicians to become leaders and make hard decisions that are unpopular. Unaffordable housing is not universal. Calgary canceled 14 housing projects because they had too many. Now, Calgary also doubled their property taxes because half of the businesses have collapsed and failed. It's an oil-based economy, so it's a catch-22. Pick your poison. The status of housing supply, everyone keeps on saying the government should build housing, the government should build housing. Well, let me tell you, the city of Oshawa got out of the business several years ago. They spent 4 years trying to get rid of the properties that they had because they had racked up a $3 million debt where they couldn't repair those properties. They couldn't give the properties away. I know firsthand, I was involved in it. They finally sold it to a private sector investor. Toronto Community Housing wrote off 1,100 units in 2017 because they didn't have any money to repair them. They had become uninhabitable. The Ministry of Housing in 2019 announced that 106,000 affordable housing units are going to be removed from the inventory. So even if they built 42 a year, as they've been talking about, 42 here and 50 there, they're going to lose 106,000 by 2027. And there are lots of examples of this all over the place. Does the government have the money? Well, you already know what I'm going to say. No. The short version is Ontario's debt is $400 billion with a B dollars in 2021. Its debt as a province is larger than 168 countries. There are 168 countries who have less debt than Ontario does. Half of our gross domestic product, which defines our wealth as a province and as a country, is tied up in debt. We're paying $9 million an hour for interest. The provincial government doesn't have the money. Now, I don't care how many people say, but my case is different. No, they're all the same. At the end of the day, they need money to build the housing, and the province doesn't have it. I'm just going to skim through this very quickly. If you looked at the municipal surplus I was talking about, the $5 billion, where is it? Well, whatever. If you take $187,000 is what I figure it costs. It's about $250 a square foot to build an apartment unit these days. Outside of Toronto, it's probably higher in Toronto, but anywhere in the 905 or 705 area code, it's probably about $250. That means that they could build with that $5 billion one time 41,000 units. After that, it's all over. There's no more money. Well, Trudeau is bringing in 400,000 immigrants this year alone, and statistically 45% of them will come to Ontario. So 200,000 immigrants alone. Forget about the refugees, forget about other Canadians that are moving into the city, forget about all the students that want to, now move into rental housing, the kids that are coming of age and so on. That's just the immigrants, 200,000. Where are they going to live? Federally, if you looked at their commitment, $40 billion over the next 10 years is what they've committed to. I ran the numbers and it'll come out to 19,000 units per year for 10 years for all of Canada. You think $40 billion is a lot? It's irrelevant. It's not going to make a dent. So Conclusion, municipal and provincial governments don't have the money. You do the math. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. Any accountant could do the math. Frankly, anyone that knows a bit about accounting. So who does have the money? Well, somebody must have the money. There's an awful lot of money in real estate. And of course, the quick answer, greedy landlords, right? We've heard that until we're blue in the face. In fact, I'm suggesting to everyone, don't call yourself a landlord anymore. Call yourself a housing provider, a residential housing provider, and remind people what it is that you're providing to society. 98% of all the housing that's ever been built in Canada was built by the private sector. 98%. All right. Government will never, ever solve the affordable housing crisis unless they engage all landlords. Out of that 98%, 49% of all rental housing in Canada is in the hands of unincorporated individuals. That's according to CMHC. That means half of all the rental units in the country are held by people who don't have a company. That's you and me, not the big guys. Yet all the legislation, all the incentives, all the programs, they all talk to the big developers as if they got billions and billions of dollars and they can solve the affordable housing. They can't. They can't do it without us, and no one ever talks to us. So I hope somebody in power is listening to what I just said. Half of all the inventory is in the hands of missing middle. Missing middle, you might loosely define as from, say, 3 units to 40 units. Nobody is building that stuff because it can't be built affordably. All of the government programs are focused on decreasing demand. None of it is built on creating supply, except that one program of 40 billion. Try and get any of that money, forget it. Try dealing with CMHC, you may as well be talking Swahili. Right? I brought several ideas to CMHC, some which we'll be talking about momentarily. And I was absolutely astonished when 2 of the program managers said, we need out of the box thinking, but your out of the box ideas don't fit within any of our in the box programs. So we can't fund them. I was absolutely blown away by that. Said, so what are you asking for? That's a rhetorical question. I don't have an answer for it. By the way, there's no holy grail. There's no quick fix. There's no set of taxes that are going to solve this problem. It's going to take a paradigm shift in mindset to be able to look at this problem in a whole new way, number one. And I'll talk about a few of those. And number 2, it's going to take a vertically integrated government agency, in my opinion, driven by the federal government, that can overrule provincial and municipal bylaws and the ways that they do things, so that there's a homogeneous goal and they're all working to a common purpose. Because right now, you can't even get the municipality to work with the province to agree on anything. They fight over land the same way that we as buyers are in multiple auctions to try and buy a piece of property. That kind of infighting is prevalent everywhere, municipally, provincially, and federally. You may not know this either, but 87% of all the land in Ontario is owned by the province. 87%. Only 13% is in the private sector hands. So where's the land coming from? Well, the province has it. What's the problem? It doesn't have electricity, doesn't have roads, doesn't have sewers. In other words, it doesn't have any infrastructure. So where's the money coming from for the infrastructure? Well, I'll get to that as well. Whatever answers we do come up with, it's got to be sustainable. And what I mean by that is if you look at government housing, the vast majority of it, not just in Toronto, Ontario, or Canada, but around the world, so much government housing falls into ruin and becomes slums and becomes center of, becomes the epicenter of crime. And even in Toronto, a disproportionate amount of crime, violent crime, comes from city-owned properties. I have those stats, I'm prepared to back them up. So the reason for that is because they're doing rents that are 30% below market, they don't understand that there's no money that's left over to pay for the one-time costs that inevitably arise, specifically things like replacing a boiler or replacing a roof or putting in all new windows. These are called capital expenses. And capital expenses don't come out of your operating budget. It does not come out of your cash flow. It comes out of the profit that you make after you've paid for all of the operations and you've paid for all your financing. The cities don't leave any money for capital costs. And that's why Toronto has a $3.5 billion backlog of repairs. And that's why they have to close 1,100 units. They don't have that money to do the repairs. Condos solve the problem. It's called a reserve fund. Why can't social housing set aside a reserve fund? It seems so brain dead obvious, and nobody does it. At least I'm not aware of anybody that is doing it. So let's get to the actionable items. How are we doing for time? I did in half an hour. Good. So I've got hopefully an hour to talk about this. So the first one I came up with is I think we could open up literally thousands of units. Landlords only, I can take most of the issues that a landlord has, especially in the screening process, looking at a new tenant, and digest that or congeal, if that's the right word, whatever it is, down to two things that landlords want. They want the rent paid on time, on the first of the month, in full, and they want the tenant to respect the property and their neighbors. So when we're doing our screening, most of what we're looking for is, will they pay the money and will they be nice? That's it, most of it. And our decisions are based on that. And what's that about? The money, right? When public agencies come to me, and I get these calls sometimes weekly, but certainly never less than once a month, I'll get a call from either, United Way, or a church or a synagogue or a mosque or the YMCA or Red Cross, et cetera, et cetera. They all call and they're all desperately looking for housing. And when you talk to them, they'll say, well, once the guys move in, we'll cover the rent for a year, then you're on your own. And I'll say, well, why can't you enter into a multi-year agreement, and why can't you be responsible for the damages? Because your clients disproportionately, and whether it's politically correct or even a breach of the Human Rights Code to say this, but the vulnerable groups that we talk about and the clients that these agencies support have a disproportionately high perceived potential for damages. Whether or not it's real or not, well, one would have to do a study. But I think if you did a poll of landlords everywhere, there would be, as long as they can maintain their anonymity, there would probably be some consensus for that. In any case, why would I want to take on all of those liabilities when in fact I could just look for someone who has 2 cars, they're both working, they're upwardly mobile, they're not married yet. Sorry, they are married, but they haven't got kids yet, which means they might take a 1 or 2 bedroom today and within 3 years move up, which is what I want, especially under rent control. The last thing I want is any tenant, regardless of their background, whether they're seniors or on ODSP, or even if they're rich. If they're going to stay more than 5 years, I don't want to rent to them. And the reason I don't want to rent to them is because they have a devastating impact on the value of your property over the long term. It's devastating. I don't mean dollars. I'll give you a 30-second snapshot. You may not be able to follow it, but if you really want to know, call me after and I'll explain it. If you take rent of let's use a senior because they're the perfect tenant. I would only rent to seniors if there wasn't rent control. But because of rent control, the senior is more likely to stay in a property than most other demographic groups. So they move in today a 1-bedroom apartment for $1,000 a month, if they're lucky. And 10 years from now, they're paying $1,200 a month. Well, because of the cost of everything else has gone up so much, but rent control has minimized our ability to collect and keep pace with those costs, the market rents are $1,500. That $300 difference may not seem like very much, and it's our obligation to society to provide that kind of a service to, the seniors who have provided service to our society for 50 years or more. Well, it's not that simple. That $300 times 12 months is $3,600. And again, not an overarching tragedy, but for every $1 of net operating income, your property increases or decreases by a factor of 20 or higher. I was saying $1 of noise is $20 of joy. And what that means is if I can add $1 to my income without adding an expense, I will add $20 to the value of the property. Conversely, if I lose $300 a month because the rents haven't kept pace with the market and my costs, and now my net operating income has dropped by $300 or $3,600 for the year, that's $72,000 per tenant. And if I have a building of 10 tenants, all seniors who have not moved, that's $750,000 and probably the value of that property for the next 10 to 20 years that I will not get. If you understand that, then PAIR becomes absolutely what I'm calling PAIR, the public agency insured rent. What I'm suggesting is that the CMHC takes some of that $40 billion. They already have the actuarial scientists and the actuarial science to assess risk. And they will assess the public agency, not us, not the landlords. And they will guarantee that to the landlord that the agency will pay for damages and pay for the rent if the agency is not able to meet its obligations. Most agencies say they can't enter those agreements because they don't know what their funding will be for next year. That's their number one retort every time I ask them, well, why can't you enter a 5-year lease or a 3-year lease? I'm not going to dwell on this too long because I got 8 more pages to talk about. But this is one thing that if the government guaranteed to landlords through their agencies that our rent would be paid on time, that the agency would pay those variable costs and that they'll cover the damages, I guarantee to you thousands, if not tens of thousands of units will become instantly available. Moving on, correctional services. Our jails are overflowing with people, and most of them aren't violent mass murderer rapists. A lot of them, are white collar crimes and other things. I think that we could take some of that talent selectively, and it would be a reward, not something that is automatic. It has to be earned, just like the old days when the best job you could get was in the prison hospital or working in the kitchen or something like that. It would be like that. You could train them so that when they get out, they've got a skill. It could be an electrician, a plumber, carpentry, masonry, any of the construction skills that we need. And because they're inmates and we're already paying for their food and board and their lodging, not to their, not because they want it, but because, that's where our taxes go. Why can't we use them to build housing? Maybe they don't build our private housing, but they could certainly build social housing. or special needs housing or hospitals. So correctional services. I have it from the horse's mouth that lenders will not finance affordable housing. Why? It's too risky. Why is it too risky? Because there's not enough profit. And if you don't build up the equity, then their exposure with the mortgage is higher than the equity that's in the property. While you as an investor would not want that either. So if you don't have lenders, you don't have the money, something like 90% of all the rental properties in Canada are financed. Only maybe 10% are held 100% without a mortgage. So no lenders, no affordable housing, period. CMHC has to do something to encourage them. And right now, they're not encouraging them. Most lenders are at the best saying, I don't want to deal with CMHC. It takes 4 months to get approvals. The approvals are atrocious. They jump through hoops. They've taken away, I don't want to get into it. They've done so many things that have absolutely destroyed the ability to create housing. I lay a lot of this failure at CMHC's feet, although it may be their political masters that are implementing the public policy that CMHC follows. So I don't know if it's the politicians at the federal level or if it's the uninformed. I'm struggling for a word other than stupidity. But unfortunately, that's the only word that comes to mind. So forgive me for being less than diplomatic. But CMHC has to do something about getting the lenders back on side, or everything else that you talk about, it's never going to happen. The money exists. There are tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in equity in properties, and one could tap into that equity. Everybody has a home. Maybe they have a $1 million home and they've got a $400,000 mortgage. Well, that means they've got $600,000 that's doing nothing for them. It's keeping their costs down, but it's dead money. It's not working for them. And the people who understand how to extract that equity and make it work for them are the ones that are buying the second house. And in many cases, it's the bank of mom and dad that is buying the house, using the equity in their property to buy the house for their child. So there are a lot of people out there who are angry and upset and frustrated about the unaffordability of properties. But let's not forget that all the people who do own properties have had an incredible increase in their net worth. Their asset value has gone through the roof, and their ability to raise money is also increased dramatically. So there's pros and cons, but nobody ever wants to talk about that side of the equation. But there's money there, and it's there for the taking. Create an incentive to get people to want to take that money out and build a second suite, build a laneway home, get together in a pool and build an apartment building. It's there. The condo model, duplicate that. The reason that everybody is building condos is because the developers only have to put 20% of their money in. 80% of it comes from where? The pre-sale of the condos, right? They sold those condos 3 years ago, but they don't put a spade into the ground until at least 70% of the condos have been sold. But they only put in 20% of their money, maybe 30, but somewhere in that range. With an apartment building, and they'll get their money out as soon as all those condos are sold, which is typically 3 to 5 years. For an apartment building, I have to put up 100% of the money, and I may not get my money out for 15 years. Why, as an investor, would I ever want to build an apartment building if I could build a condo? And the other benefit of condos, they've got that reserve. No apartment buildings do that. All right, I'll just keep on moving on. By the way, condos have inevitable upgrades, but cemeteries, finally, the government around 1990, 1996, somewhere in that time frame, passed the Cemetery Act, which requires every cemetery to collect and put aside 40%. That could be 50% now, but I know it used to be 40% of all the money that's collected is put into a trust that's used for the perpetual care of those grounds. Well, why can't we do that? Why can't some of that money be put aside? Here's a big one, and this would require a fundamental change in mindset of everybody involved, the politicians, the tenants, and the landlords. But if you could do this, I guarantee to you, you would solve 80% of the conflict between landlords and tenants. 80% of it. The commercial industry, the retail plazas, the industrial centers, the office buildings, and so on, they all work on what they call a triple net lease, typically, not 100%, but for the most part, they do what's called a triple net lease. What that means is that the tenant pays two rents. They pay for the rent of the floor space on a per square foot basis, and they pay on a per square foot basis whatever the operating costs are. So the tenant pays for all of the ongoing costs, and they pay a percentage of whatever the maintenance costs are of the building. If you had the tenants pay for the electricity and the water and the property tax and the building insurance and the maintenance, all of a sudden, everything changes. If a tenant has to pay for their own water, as soon as that toilet is running or that tap is leaking, they're going to call you the next day and want it fixed. Or in fact, they'll call somebody to get it fixed. But if they don't have to pay for the water, it'll be 3 months. And I guarantee to you, one running toilet in an apartment building for 1 month will double the total water cost for that whole building. One toilet. So it has a profound impact. If we could create a triple net lease and get tenants to agree to that, however, you would also, as landlords, have to give them control over those expenses such that if there was a savings, they get the savings, not us. It's a two-way street. It can't go one way. But modify that, and many of the issues that we have, I've already written a lease agreement like that, and I tried it, and I could not get the support of any government agencies. I could not get the support of the municipality. I spent $1 million, opened up a senior's home with a model like this, and shut it down after a year. On top of that, none of the banks would finance that affordable home for seniors. It was too risky. I already talked about construction industry. We need to do something to encourage people to get back into those trades. They're not going in. And I've said enough about that for now. CMHC kills small investors. They have these, the CMHC has this no equity extraction policy that they passed a year and a half ago. Well, what had happened was that when the COVID hit and everyone thought that tenants were going to default on their rents en masse, not in any small measure, because our illustrious premier said, oh, if you have to pay for food and you can't pay for the rent, don't worry about the rent. So CMHC received over 500 applications from all the big operators that said, we want to refinance our buildings. And they were literally hit with trillions of dollars. So they passed a they passed policy that said, we're not going to allow anybody to take the money out of the property for the purposes of doing anything except to repair those properties or to buy another one. Well, that may be okay to stop the big guys, but you and me worked for 20 years so that we could build up the equity in our home so we could take some of that money out and live on it for retirement. For many of us, this is our retirement income, And CMHC said, we're not funding any mortgages where you want to take the money out for retirement. Duh. They also had this fatally flawed definition, as I talked about before, that the rent should be 30% below market. Well, that's tied to the income of the renter. That doesn't deal with, is it affordable for the landlord who has to pay for the electricity and the gas and the property taxes and the building insurance and the lawyers and all the other things, maintenance grounds? Well, no, of course not. Is it profitable for the builder? Is it profitable for the person who bought the land? Well, CMHC doesn't care about any of that stuff, and it's not tenable. The big operators could do it, but the missing middle and the small guys, the people who want to rent out a house or want to rent out their basement as a second suite, it's not viable. And these guys, well, I'm just repeating myself. They don't think about it. They kill financing deals. CMHC kills tons of financing deals, not only because they're taking typically 4 months now when people are trying to close a deal in 30 days, but also because they're over-exaggerating the expenses to make the property look much less profitable than it really is. By doing that, it reduces the amount of money that they have to insure. It also forces us as investors to put more money in, so that may not necessarily be such a bad thing, especially if interest rates rise. But if they're going to take 4 months and then kill the deal, that's not exactly a win-win for anybody. And if they're trying to encourage investment in rental properties, this is not the way to do it. They're torpedoing deals left, right, and center. CRA stands for Canada Revenue, in case you guys don't know that, or someone doesn't know that. I mentioned before that the government takes 50% of our profit. Well, that is for anybody who doesn't have 5 employees or more. If you have 5 employees or less and you're in this rental business, then your property is treated as passive income, the same as if you own bonds. You don't have to do anything. Well, I can tell you, I work a hell of a lot harder running this business, and even with 71 units, I still don't have a property manager. And if I had 4 employees, I could not make a profit. I ran the numbers, and I think your properties have to be generating somewhere around $1.5 to $2 million in income for you to be able to justify 5 employees. And they can't be friends. They can't be relatives. You can't employ your wife, your spouse, or your children. They have to be. It's these arcane things that are designed by CRA to guarantee their revenue stream without any thought given into the impact of what it is that they're doing. If you have 5 employees, your income is taxed, or your profit is taxed at 13%. If you don't have 5 employees, it's taxed at 50%. What's the rationale? There isn't one. There is none. It's purely arbitrary. Amortize the costs. Instead of amortizing a $20,000 expense over 15 years, amortize it over 3 years. If they did that, then we'd be able to show more profit more quickly, and that would create more incentive for people to get into the business. This money that you write off, called a capital cost allowance, or effectively depreciation, all has to be paid back when you sell the property. If you want to incentivize and get people to invest in building these things, reduce or remove this recoverable capital cost allowance, RCCA. MPAC does the exact opposite of what CRA does, or of what CMHC does. MPAC overvalues a property because the higher they can raise the property value, the more the taxes are that the municipalities will receive. And who funds MPAC? All the municipalities. They're in it to generate income for the municipalities. How do they do that? MPAC does not look at an investment property and say, this is what the net operating income is, and this is what the profitability is. They look at the property and say, okay, this property in this market should be generating this amount of money. And if it was properly maintained and was getting market rents, in other words, there's no rent control. But if you've got a tenant who's been in there 20 years, MPAC doesn't say, okay, well, we'll accommodate that rent control, low tenant. They'll just say, well, that unit should be generating $1,500 and it's only generating $9. So we'll treat the property as $1,500. So they overvalue the property and they kill you on the property tax. So CRA gets you at one end, the municipalities get you at the other end, and they're all siphoning from the property. You want to solve that problem? MPAC has to start treating the properties the way the government treats the market. Look at the rent control, look at the true capitalization rate that properties trade at. And if you don't know what that is, that's a long conversation that I cannot get into here. That would take 3 hours just to explain by itself. But that cap rate, you can think of it as a return on investment. So the higher that return on investment, the more money you as a seller would get. But they're killing that as landlords. Sorry, as assessing our property as we as landlords. Sorry if I confused you there. This is another big one that is easy to fix. If you look at Durham, all the municipalities, I think there are 10 of them, all of them are hugely abusive of this tax process. It's not the landlords who pay property tax. We remit it, but we don't actually pay it. It's the tenants who pay it, and we collect it on their behalf. And that's built into the Residential Tenancies Act. It's built into the above guideline increase, and it's built into the process that some of you may have run into. When property tax decreases, the city automatically sends out a letter to every tenant saying, your property tax decreased, so your rent automatically decreases. Here's the number, and you don't have to get permission from the landlord. You can just deduct it off the rent. Well, the only way they could do that is if the tenants were actually paying the property tax. If we have a property tax increase, then we can apply through an above guideline increase, which takes 2 years, not 30 days, 2 years to get the LTB to allow you to get a portion of that money back. So the property taxes increase, you could apply for it, which means the tenants pay. Well, the tenants are paying. If you look at the mill rate, and what the mill rate is the tax rate that each city applies to different types of properties. For a single family home versus an industrial property versus, in this case, a rental property. While the rental properties are being taxed at 2 to 2.5 times more, which means the tenants collectively are paying 2.5 times more tax than the people who own homes. Now, the people who own homes, I would argue, are probably more affluent than most renters. Not all renters, but most renters. And if that's the case, at the very least, there should be equality. At the very best, low-income housing should be taxed at a lower rate than single-family homes. And it's not. This is an incredible abuse. Not all municipalities do it, but all of Durham does. Here's a big one. And I know I will get raked over the coals for saying this, but you gotta let me finish what I'm about to say. Government should not be building any general purpose social housing. Instead, take all that money, whether it's a municipality, province, or the federal government, build the roads, build a police station, put in hydro towers, put in the sewer system, or even work collaboratively, heaven forbid, with the private sector to put in those things. I guarantee to you that builders, large and small, would line up to infill. In other words, you put in the roads, you put in the infrastructure, and everybody would line up without incentive to build the housing. And they would do it out of their own pocket. That's where the money should go. And if you want to look at major infrastructure projects, you look at the interstate highways that were built in the 50s and 60s, well, actually even before that, in the 40s in the United States. Those interstate highways were funded and took 1/3 of the total federal budget. All money from every conceivable agency in the American government, 1/3 of it went to build those interstate highways, and they got built. That's a program the government should be looking at. How could they replicate that? If you really want housing, this is the way to do it. And again, I don't want to dwell on this too long because I want to get to the part that I promised you, where all of this, if it falls on deaf ears, at least I can help you make your property more affordable. And I've got 30 bullets, which I have at the end of this presentation. So I want to skip through some of this stuff. If you build it, they will come. A rising tide raises all ships. And that's what we're really talking about here. If you raise even the people at the top end who are in our high-end luxury properties, rental properties, and move them into houses, then everybody else will move up. It's not like all of a sudden a whole new group is going to come in the middle and knock out the lower classes. I believe that there would be a percolation upwards, especially if you increase supply. Don't fund lower rents for properties. Fund the low income people to give them the money that they need to pay market rents. And if the market rents stabilize and the low income people can get the money that they need to top up and compete effectively against the people who have the money. No one needs to know that the tenant is getting 70% of their money from their job and 30% from a rent supplement. Or if it's guaranteed by the government, maybe landlords would prefer that, to have someone where at least a portion of them, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So increase tenant supplements. Don't fund 30% below market value rental properties. It's fatally flawed and inevitably will lead to failure. The single best thing that anybody could do, the least expensive way to increase housing availability in a built-up urban area where there is transit, where there is schools already established and the roads and the, all the things that we need and that we want to be close to, is to build second suites. That would be easy, and the government wouldn't have to pay for it. Maybe they could create a tax incentive, but they wouldn't need to. If I knew that I'm not going to get crucified by the Residential Tenancies Act and by the prejudices and biases of the landlord and tenant board adjudicators who make sweeping judgments, often nonsensically, if I hope that's not too strong a word, but there's certainly a lot of judgments that have come out of the LTB that are highly questionable, and many that have been overturned by the superior courts. In fact, the superior courts have often criticized the LTB, and there's public statements on that. The Americans created an income housing tax credit where the housing providers reserve a portion of the units, and the landlords charge a lower rent. Well, that doesn't seem like anything that's different from what we've got here, but the landlords get a benefit back in the form of a tax credit. And they've created 2.3 million units over the last 25 years, give or take. Well, there must be something there that's working. Can we learn from that and embrace it ourselves? Back to the second suites, it's got to be easily financed, it's got to be compelling, and you got to fix the Residential Tenancies Act. Now, landlords think it's brutal against them, and tenants say that landlords have too much flexibility. Well, I can tell you, out of the 46 breaches that are under the RTA, 10 of them mutually benefit the landlord and the tenant. 34 exclusively benefit the tenant, and one exclusively benefits the landlord. So you tell me that the RTA is fair and balanced. That is a meadow filled with horse, ... Let the bailiffs. One of the main reasons that we have LTB backlog is because we can only use government bailiffs. That sounds fishy to me, like job protection. There is no reason why we can't have private bailiffs. When the government started talking about it, the tenant said, oh, sure. So now that we got more bailiffs, you'll be able to evict us in a week. Well, no, it's still going to take months. There's still an adjudication process. There's still a hearing that has to be done. And most importantly, why should they be worried about evictions if they're paying their rent on time? It should be an irrelevant conversation, but tenant advocates live to create animosity. If there wasn't conflict between landlords and tenants, tenant advocates wouldn't exist. Licensed private bailiffs. Some of these other things are nice to have. The Residential Tenancies Act is actually arbitrated and governed and policed by two agencies. The LTB, which everyone knows about as landlords, but 85% of all tenant applications go through the Ministry of Housing's Rental Housing Enforcement Unit. It's a separate agency, and they're supposed to help us and landlords and tenants equally, but 85% of their activity is to prosecute landlords and protect tenant interests. That's not their mandate, but that's what they do. And we're paying for it. Those two agencies should be amalgamated. You would save tens of millions of dollars. We talked about the property tax already. This is something that a lot of people would say, Chris, are you an idiot? Abandon incentive for first-time home buyers. Well, why would you give anyone, a first-time home buyer, an incentive? All that does, in my mind, is you've created more competition. So now you've got someone who's got some money, they get a buyer incentive. That means they can compete now. So instead of having 12 people who are competing for that same property, you've now got 20 people because 8 of them are first-time home buyers who have some extra incentives. They're still not going to win. That's the tragedy of it. I'd be really interested if anyone had any stats that could show me that first-time home buyers won the property or were able to buy a property because they had that home incentive. Once you've got the supply catching up to demand, that's when you would bring in that incentive. But to do it today makes no sense to me. Anyone that wants to live together in a shared environment, 4 people, they want to live in a co-living environment, we should incentivize that in some way with a tax deduction. You're giving up some privacy, but you're getting something else in return. And of course, the biggest issue is saving some money if you can get along with your housemates. I think that should have some kind of incentive. I'm not going to get into descaling rent control because that's a long conversation. And no matter what I say, until you fully understand all of the implications of rent control, this is dead in the water before it starts, because it's political suicide for any politician to even think about it. But politicians better start thinking about it, because as far as I'm concerned, rent control is what destabilized the housing market. We went from 40,000 units built in 1 year in 1972 in Ontario to 4,000 units. In other words, a 90% drop in 3 years. What happened in 1975? Rent control started. And 82% of all the rental properties, the purpose-built rental properties in Ontario, were built before 1979. 8 out of 10 are over 40 years old, 50 years old. Is that right? Whatever it is. 1980 plus 40 is 2020. So 40 years. 80% of all the rental inventory in Ontario is over 40 years old. All of it. I want to get to the other topics, so I'm not going to. This is, I wrote an expose where I actually went through all the numbers of 168 insurance companies. The article was published and completely ignored. But the property industry has had one of the best years in living memory. And you know that because most of you have probably got anywhere from a 20 to 100% increase in your property building insurance premium. And if you want to know why, look at the gargantuan profits. If you want to know about this article, I can send you the link. But it analyzes in details, and it's from the horse's mouth. I'm not making any of this up. The industry published rave reviews about how successful they were. And it's because we're being raked over. And not just us, the retail industry, because of all their issues, the insurance said, you're too risky. So we're quadrupling your insurance premiums. And there's articles all over the internet about retailers being hammered by the insurance industry. In any other climate, it would be called profiteering. And yet, politicians are doing nothing. I filed a formal complaint with the Competition Bureau, and an officer actually called me back, which is unheard of. And he said, I'd love to look at this, but our hands are tied. We can't do it. The only people that can address this issue are the politicians. Blah, 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 sorry. One of the biggest issues that we have, inflation is hitting us everywhere because we cannot get spare parts for anything. I don't care if it's a valve for your radiator or you need a computer chip for your oven. Everything is being held back at the ports, the water ports, both in the States and in Canada. 72% of everything that gets delivered in Ontario is delivered by truck. Only 23% is delivered by everything else, which are boats, planes, and trains. But all of those trucks come from the water ports, and you can't get anything through there. If you look at the States, they've got ships that are sitting for weeks in the harbor waiting to be unloaded. I presume it's the same in Canada, and we never hear about it in the news. But this should be at, if you want to talk about a housing crisis, you got to start with the ports, because all of the stuff that we buy doesn't come from Canada. Our lumber went up 4 times in 1 year. But so did concrete, glass, and steel. Study the 1960s. What did we do right? Well, that would take a month. This is a rhetorical question. I know what the answers are, but that would take a month just to talk about it all. But government should be looking at that, and they're not. Apply the true rent increase, housing intensification, electricity is a killer, alternative housing styles. We sort of touched on that before. I'm talking about multi-generational homes. So you build the home at first just for a single family with kids, but eventually your mom and dad may have to move back in. So you could have a suite for them in the basement or upstairs, and the house was already designed for that. Or what's happening now is the sandwich generation, where people in their 30 to 45-year range are being hit on both sides, where their parents are coming back to live with them because they can no longer afford to live on their own, and their kids that went out to work are coming back to live because they can't buy a house, and the rents are atrocious. So now they're being sandwiched between the seniors and the juniors, and they can't get ahead themselves. So create other incentives to do that. Stop calling yourself a landlord. I actually wrote A manifesto seems like everybody, when they think of manifesto, they automatically think of the Communist Manifesto and some kind of, Communist Party thing. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about a set of beliefs, actions, objectives, goals, common understandings. That's what a manifesto is. Get everybody on the same page about what a residential landlord is and what we want to do to improve housing. That should be written. And I wrote that years ago at that website. It's a draft, it's not complete, and it doesn't have input. It needs to be improved. But I would suggest that would be a good place. That would be something that we should be doing, or the government should be doing, as a good place to start. And let's start finding some politicians who have courage to make unpopular decisions and support them when they make unpopular decisions. That's our problem. Whether at the federal, provincial, or municipal level, they're all catering to and pandering to votes. And it's getting us nowhere. So with that, I've got 15 minutes left, and I want to really talk about these, how we can make the property more affordable to you. So if you don't know what a suite meter is, that is a separate meter for each utility for each rental unit. When I bought my first property, it had 11 units, and my electricity bill 12 years ago was $15,000 a year. I installed suite meters within a year of that. And today, my electricity bill is about $350, let's call it $400 a month. Times 12 is $5,000. So it went from $15,000 12 years ago, which is probably $20,000 today, down to $5,000. That $15,000 represents, times 20, what is that? $300,000. I added $300,000 to the value of my property by getting all the tenants to pay for their own electricity. I can take that $300,000 and go and retire, take the money out and, a retirement plan, or I could take it out and use it to go and buy another property. Now do that with water, do that with natural gas. They're harder to do, but electricity is easy to do. And don't get a third-party provider, because they charge $15 a month per tenant to do nothing. $15 a month. They tell you that they're going to spend all the money to put everything in place, and they're going to build the tenants. While the municipalities will build the tenants, so you don't have to worry about that part. And the cost to install a meter is $1,000 per unit. So in my case, it cost me $11,000, and I increased the value 300,000. Suite meter everything. That's why it's number one. Whether it's a duplex, your in-law or your second suite. Sorry, I had a senior's moment there. Your second suite meter. It also gets rid of all the arguments, right? People won't argue and say you're spending more electricity than I am, so why should I pay that much? Replace all your old gas appliances, especially furnaces and boilers. You might think it costs $20 or $20,000. It cost me to replace a boiler in a 9-unit property I have. And it took me only 3 years to get my money back from the savings. That $3,000 savings that I got, or 7 years. No, it was 3 years. But whatever it was about, no, I guess it was 7 years to get my money back. But I added $3,000 in savings from my billing. So my net operating income increased by 3, which is $60,000 of equity. So yeah, you have to pay $20,000, but I increased the property's value by $60,000 immediately, and I put $3,000 in my pocket every year forever. Why wouldn't you do that? Never rent or lease hot water tanks. And a lot of people do it, and you're being royally, and if you'll pardon my language, you're being royally screwed. All right? If you do the math, you take a hot water tank, it costs $600 and maybe $500 to install it, or $400, let's call it $1,000 to keep the numbers simple. How long do hot water tanks last? 10 years, 15 years? I got tanks that have lasted 20, but let's say it's 10 years. Now, if you go and pay the lease company, they guarantee that they'll replace that tank for free, as long as you pay them $35 or $40 a month. Run the numbers. $40 a month is times 12 is $480. Times 10 years is $4,800. So you're going to pay $4,800 for peace of mind, or you can take your chances, put it in the hot water tank, wait till it dies, and pay $1,000 in that same 10-year period. All right. I just wanted that to sink in. This number 4 may or may not apply to you, but in Oshawa, I discovered, or in Durham, I discovered that I had 2 apartment buildings. One had a 25 millimeter pipe meter, and the other one had a 35 millimeter pipe meter. That 35 millimeter cost me twice as much to rent because I couldn't buy it. In many municipalities, you can buy it, but not in Durham. You got to rent it because it's a guaranteed income for the region. But both properties use the same amount of water. And even when the water doubled in my smaller meter, it still handled all the volume. So I was literally paying double the price, which worked out to about $80 savings per month times 12 months. How much is that? 800, 960, call it $1,000 a year. That's $20,000 in equity, and it's $1,000 in my pocket. Look at your water bill and see whether or not you're overpaying for, if you're leasing a meter, first of all, and if you're overpaying for it. Offer a large incentive. You think that paying 4 months rent costs you too much to get rid of a tenant? Well, let's take a tenant who's paying $900 a month and you could get $1,500 a month. All right, what's the difference between that? That's $600. So you give them 900 times 4 nines are 36, call it $4,000. You give them $4,000. You will get back $600 times 12. What is that? 7,200? Yeah, 7,200. So you'll get your money back in a year to a year and a half, but you will have added the difference between 7,000 and whatever it was. Let's say it's $2,000. So you will have added $40,000 by getting rid of that tenant by paying them $4,000. If you understand what cap rates are, how NOI works, and that concept of 20 to 1, all of these decisions become brain dead obvious and can improve your affordability without screwing over anybody. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Without having to pay more tax to the government, except that if you're profitable, you're going to pay a higher property tax, right? Because they're going to take a piece of it. And if you're profitable, you're going to have to pay more corporate tax at the back end on your profits. But I don't mind paying more tax if I'm making more money, as long as it's fair. So increase your insurance deductible. That seems like a stupid thing to say, but insurance is not about covering vandalism or replacing a window or fixing a pothole. It's about when the place burns down or somebody is killed or somebody is maimed because they slipped on your icy parking lot, or there was a flood. It's about catastrophic recovery. I don't insure my properties for $1,000 deductible. I insure them for $10,000 deductible. If I have bigger properties. For a house or a duplex or something, pick a reasonable number. I would suggest $5,000 and see what your premium is. Now, last year, I asked for that and they offered me a $100 deduction. I say, you guys retarded? You're going to double my deduction, my deductible, and you're giving me a $100 premium on a $3,000 cost. That's profiteering. That's absolutely outrageous. But once we get past COVID, or even now, if you're in the middle of it, look at what it would cost for a deductible, but make sure your perils are properly covered. You know, all the things that could go wrong. Don't get rid of things that you don't think you'll need, because I guarantee to you, Murphy is waiting in the basement. As soon as you say, I don't need that coverage, it's going to happen to you. So make sure you got the proper coverage. but don't go with the lowest deductible. You're wasting your money. Replace all your incandescent fluorescent lamps. If you haven't done so, do so immediately. LEDs use 1/6 of the power. I did a study a couple of years ago in a spreadsheet. If you want it, let me know, I'll send it to you. But the net result was that whatever I'm paying now for lighting, it will cost you 1/6 of the cost. That's guaranteed, guaranteed. Not everything, but all of your lighting costs. And they can be significant, especially in this day and age. Separate out your parking fee from your rent. And there are many reasons to do this. One reason is that if a tenant comes and says, I don't need parking, so I want a deduction. Well, you can say, no, rent is extra. The second is, if they don't need a parking space, why should they get one and then rent it out to somebody and get that income? That should be your income. You have to maintain that property. You have to do the snow plowing. You have to do the repairs and fill the potholes, not them. And thirdly, if somebody moves in and they got 2 cars and you only have 12 spaces for 12 units, but if one of your tenants doesn't need that space, now you automatically got one to bring somebody in that might be better qualified, maybe even a higher rental income. You may think that your coin operated machines are not a big deal. But if I go from $1.50 to $2 on my washing machine or my dryer, that is 50 cents on the $1.50. That's a 33% increase. It's only 50 cents to the tenant, but it's a 33% increase in your laundry income. In my properties, I generate $10,000 a year in laundry income. Now you might say, wow, that's fantastic. Well, no, $7,000 goes to electricity, it goes to water, it goes to sewer, and then I have to amortize the cost of those machines, which cost around $1,500 each. That has to go into there. And then there's repairs and maintenance. And then the occasional flooding when the sewer backs up. So it's not as much as you might think. You're probably getting 20 cents on the dollar, which is why you never go to these coin operators who are saying, we'll take, I think they take 30% of the revenue and give you 70%. That 30% revenue is more than 50% of the profit, more than 50. It could be upwards of 70% when you factor in all your other costs. An AGI is an above guideline increase. Whenever you make a capital investment, look into an AGI. It is your way of recovering some of those costs. But what it really does is it allows you to increase the rent a little bit beyond what the guideline is. And that little bit can have a dramatic impact on the equity value of your property over the long term. 2 years ago, I did one where the property taxes went up 5%, and I invested 3% into capital costs, and the automatic guideline was 2%. Once I got my AGI approved, I was able to increase the rents by 10%. Now that might sound outlandish, but 5% of that was the government screwing over the tenant, not us. We didn't raise the property tax, they did. All right, so it was a 5% increase, not 10. Just in case there's a tenant out there who wants to crucify me later. For some owners, if you're only a 1 to 4 person operator, it may be in your best interest to incorporate a company that's active in property management, because you'll be paying a 13% tax corporately instead of 50%. So what I'm doing in a couple of cases is I have my real estate company charge my property. All my properties are held by companies, and that company has a property management fee, so that reduces the profit in that property because of the expense. I transfer that revenue over to the property management company, which has to pay tax, the same amount, but now I'm only paying 13% on that amount instead of 50% on that amount. It won't work for you if you only own 1 or 2 houses. But if you own 5 or 10 houses, ask your accountant or talk to somebody who knows about this stuff. Real estate agents should know this. They don't. I would argue
Chris,
yeah. Are we out of time?
sorry. Yeah, I'm just going to let you know that it's 7:59 right now.
Okay.
And I knew that there was
What?
just checking to see if there's any questions.
Oh. Uh-oh.
Sorry, Tony Cosio, you're going live here.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. So why don't you tell me what the questions are? Because I can't see them if they're in chat.
Okay. Yeah, they're in chat. Actually, there was a lot of comments, very positive comments. People interested in the slides, as well as talking with you after. And in addition, they wanted the recording. So I've let them know that to contact you, anyone from NNLA Association, the Near North Landlords Association. We're going to be putting our recording and your slides when we get them into, we have our own private forum on Facebook, and we're going to put it right there.
Okay.
So
I scroll down to the bottom of my screen. Is it still being presented?
it's still recording.
Okay, so you can, no, what I meant is, can you see my email address?
Yes.
All right,
Chris
so
Seepe, yes.
Or has a question. If the question requires a lot of writing, I'm not going to write back. I'll call you, or you can call me. It's just a lot easier that way. But if you want a copy of the presentation, I'll happily send you this. Okay, just send me an email. Sorry, go ahead.
That's it. Yeah, I'm just trying to see if I can find another question. There were some people that there's actually a number of people thought that you should run for prime minister.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah.
I thought about actually running for a councillor in Oshawa. And even though I've invested millions into that city, and I provide homes for over 50 tenants in that city, I can't run for councillor unless I live in that city.
Oh.
So I said, forget it.
Yeah.
But I did think about it.
Well, Chris, I think there's a lot of comments in here as far as people really thought this was very helpful. There was people that said makes sense. So I'm trying to look for questions, because I think we've answered all the questions. I responded to some of them because they were just, it wasn't about the topic. It was just, like the slides and things like that. So I think we have no more questions and nothing at all, unless you want to open up the lines, and then we can see if we've got a few minutes to answer any kind of questions.
People want to, people can leave. It's 8 o'clock officially.
It is.
I could spend 5 minutes and just finish the last couple of points, but I do want to point out number 13. Never, ever not increase your rent by the guideline. Increase it by the max, because you will never get ahead of the costs unless you do. All right, no matter what people say, that 1.2% may not seem like much, but it can have a dramatic impact long-term, because you can't catch up. All right.
Good piece of advice.
And one last piece. Sorry, I should have gone through this. I'm sorry I ran out of time. But always take your mortgage. Try and arrange for your mortgages to come out on the 10th of the month, not the 1st of the month when you're given paid by everybody else. Collect all the money from the tenants and then pay the mortgage 10 days later. That way you don't have to keep your mortgage in the bank, and you have better cash flow. You don't have to keep that $3,000 or $5,000 in the bank all the time. When the mortgage comes out on the 1st, in case tenants don't pay, you'll know who's paid. And 70% always pay before the 1st. So you got the mortgage covered if you pay on the 10th. Sorry. Questions?
Oh, that's excellent. Is there any questions? I don't think so. Chris, is that somebody trying to ask a question?
I don't know if we're supposed to raise our hand or how we say who we are, but so many fantastic suggestions and so many great ideas, and so many ways that we've known how we've been screwed over the years. And yet, to make these changes, all I have to say, Chris, you are one brave and fantastic man to take this on. because I can't even imagine what we would have to do to incorporate some of these changes. Just asking about these incredible raises in our insurance. I mean, it has to be a full-time job for all of us, and so many more besides all of us. Where do we start? How does it happen?
Talk to your local counselor, I would say, is where you start. Or if you've got an inroad to the mayor, go beat him up or her.
You know,
If you're an informed citizen will get great things done if they apply themselves, if they go after the politicians. But you have to be informed. You can't just say, why are you, there's a major debate going on in Oshawa right now where they just built 42 units for the homeless. And there's all kinds of other people who have come out in the public forum and said, oh, great, you took care of the homeless who will trash the place, they're all on drugs. And what about us who are barely able to make ends meet? That's the kind of response you're getting. And you've got to be prepared to tell the mayor how to respond to that, because they may not be prepared for that kind of thing, or they are prepared for it, but they don't have an answer. So I
but the
think
bottom line is, we're not the votes they're looking for. The majority of people, they're looking for the people who are going to vote for them. And there aren't enough, what do we call ourselves now? Residential housing providers to make a difference in what's important to them, which is their vote.
they're not taking advantage of the power that they have. They have incredible economic power. We pay tens of billions of dollars in property tax if we put ourselves together. But the landlord associations are territorial, right? They're not really trying to get together to make this thing work. And the Ontario Association, FRIPL, really is only interested in the big guys. Now they're going to probably chastise me or beat me up for that, but that's everything I say here, by the way, is my opinion, and I will stand by it. But please don't.
Let me just add here that we've actually got Chris to come back to the Affordable Housing Providers of Ontario, which is in the steering committee. So Chris now is a participant with a number of presidents of this small and medium-sized landlords in Ontario who are working towards making some changes a little bit at a time. And so Chris is going to, he's already been a participant at one time and then is come back. And I'm excited to have us start looking at this stuff and making some changes. We've made some significant changes in the past, and all it was just door knocking, because if you don't do anything or say anything, nothing's ever going to change. So all it does is it just takes one person, and each one of us does, takes a topic or a subject and starts talking starts knocking on the doors, start asking questions, putting people on spot. And, and things happen, things can change. We have the power to change things.
Yes. Is there a way for residential housing providers in all sections of Ontario to be better unified than we are now? Maybe that's something that if we were more unified and more people would hear the way Chris speaks, and he's so knowledgeable, it's an area that needs more thought and looking into, if that's possible. Why are we all so separated? I mean, I've owned a property, mind you, very tiny. I'm a very tiny residential housing provider. I only have one building, so maybe I just haven't been knowledgeable because of that. But this is the first I've only heard about these Chris's organization and the work that he's doing just in the last year. So why aren't we more connected to each other and more supportive of each other the way other unions and organizations are?
Can I make
I
a
think-
suggestion?
I think this is the first step, right? You're
Can I
here
make
now.
a suggestion too?
Absolutely, Christina.
My suggestion from what I know and the people I know who are residential housing providers, quite a lot of them are not educated enough to understand what Chris is saying. It's quite simply, I mean, let's face it. I make part of my living by writing and interpreting and language work. And I am getting to it with a little bit of work. I can understand what he says. Quite a lot of the people who have the second unit in their house are not up to understanding the situation at all. The reason why they make so many mistakes in terms of investment, in terms of managing their investments, is that, I mean, for instance, let's give you an example of the community I know, the Italian community. There is 250,000 of them in Toronto, first and second generation. These are people who, first of all, the older people are functionally illiterate and they barely understand English enough to go shopping and do their daily life. These are quite a lot of them are construction workers who built the house for the children. And I personally know, for instance, one of them who had 4 children and he was building his 4th house because it was only fair that each child should have a house. And I mean, the guy was illiterate in both Italian and English. He had understood how to read drawings, and he was a roofer.
Christina, I get your point. And that will always be the challenge, no matter what the issue is. Whether you're talking about affordable housing, you're talking about how to operate a car, there will always be those kinds of challenges. And the answer is education. But before you can even get to the point of education, you've got to have some kind of leadership. And that's what Tricia was getting at, is that that's what you were getting at Hope was getting at is there not a way to get all of these different associations who are supposed to represent our collective interests as landlords to work together? And really, we have tried that. And it's the reason I walked away is because it wasn't successful.
But it depends on who they are paid by.
Pardon me?
It depends who really finances them. They are working for the people who pay them.
Well, yes, money talks. But your question is a valid one, but there is no easy answer right now. You really need to find some leadership, and you need to find people who have decision-making authority in government to listen. And usually, well, I don't want to get into all of that. There's biases there. So I'm just going to let that go.
Well, as this other lady said, it really depends on how many votes these people in the government get.
Yeah,
And
some of that.
as long as we are so few who understand the situation, we will not get it. It's a matter of numbers here.
There's we will not be able to serve any purpose by continuing to talk about what's wrong. If you have questions about how we can try and fix it, then we should do that. But we're already past our limit. And anybody that wants to stay, I'm happy to stay and talk. Unless Tricia, you sort of want to formalize the end.
I do have to formalize and end it, but you have your phone number that we've had it on the emails. So
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
there's your email address, your phone number,
I didn't
and
put-
then there's,
But
sorry,
for those that are there, my phone number is 416-525-1558. I'll say it one more time, 416 525-1558. But if you send me an email, I can also send you my phone number.
Yes. Well, I'd just like to say, Chris, you were inspiring, really. And in this one night, I've just learned so much. And if we can keep doing this, that's an inspiration in itself.
Well, that kind of support inspires me to want to do more. So thank you for that.
And please,
I agree.
don't take my observation as being against you. For
No,
sure.
I don't. Not at all. Not at all.
So it's a reality, part of the
You know-
reality.
You know that privately I have been supporting you and I have purchased your course and things like that. So
Yeah.
please don't misunderstand me.
I don't. Not at all. I don't take any of that in a negative light. That's just the reality that we need to overcome somehow.
Well, I think we have to call it an end to the evening. It's 8:15 now. I want to thank you, Chris, for an excellent summary of the affordable housing, some solutions. And I also want to thank everybody for joining. I think this is just wonderful. And perhaps we can talk about a second revisit to this, and we can talk about specifically one or two. We can ask maybe the attendees if they're interested. They can send you an email of what particular solution they like best, and maybe we can have a
Send it to you.
one time. Yeah, send it to you, Chris.
Okay.
And then that way it gives you a topic to
Sure.
get a little bit, another presentation that we can, so it slims it right down and we can talk specifically about that, and then leave a nice amount of time for Q&As and actually some discussions.
Yeah.
Open discussions, and we can facilitate, okay?
That sounds wonderful.
Wonderful, good.
All right.
Thank
you.
you very much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well,
Look
if
forward to
welcome.
the
Good
next
night.
one.
Super,
And thank you.
thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
More people on here than I thought.